Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com. I'm here today with part 2 of this 4-part video series on the 1/16 scale radio-controlled M4A3 76 Sherman that we have here. In part 1 of this video series, I described the model's original condition when I started the project, and I also went ahead and went into more depth on the model's background, the history, and all that stuff. Well, in this video, we're going to pick up when the model is started, and we're going to go ahead and go through all of the work, or I should say a good portion of the work, that went into the build, bringing it up to the condition here. Part 3 of this video series is going to focus exclusively on the exterior detail finish and fittings, while part 4 we're going to take this thing for a test drive. So with all that out of the way, let's resume and pick up where we left off since the last video. Now that the model is fully unboxed, it's now time to dig into the actual rebuild. Now I already have the hubcap off. In order to take off the sprockets, you utilize a Allen wrench. This is an M4 fastener, so any metric Allen wrench key like this one here should be more than suffice at the job at hand. Just some turns are all that are needed to take the sprockets off. These are not held on with any sort of Loctite, not stock out of the box, that is, so they should come off without any problems. There we go. This is now removed, as is the sprocket. Now the sprockets I'm going to keep in a little parts bag. Like I said before, I'm not going to be utilizing these sprockets for this build because I'm going to be swapping out the Taigen track with the Mantle ones. So these ones here are going to be destined to the boneyard. But I always like to keep parts like this in a self-contained bag. It makes it easier when it comes time to sorting out parts, or if I ever need one, I have a bag ready to go with all the components in it, and it cuts down on looking for parts. So that's a quick little tip to point out. In addition to the sprocket, I also, of course, removed the hubcaps. I didn't get that on screen, but basically the hubcaps are just held on with friction. With a small flathead screwdriver, you just pry them off. Once they pop off, you get access to the fastener underneath. At this point, continue with the teardown. First thing I'm going to do is going to be removal of the row wheels. And maybe the rear idler, depends how I feel about that. But with the row wheels out of the way, I could then get access to these inner locations over here, where we have these fasteners that are used to hold in the battery tray. Obviously, the battery tray is held in, and it's a nice method to do so. It's not going to come loose on you. But visually, the fastener heads are exposed, and this does detract from the look. So I'm going to go ahead and plug these up with the bodywork. To do so, the removal of the row wheels does make the job a little bit easier, and since I'm going to be repainting the row wheels anyway, they need to be removed off of the model so I can take the rubber tires off of them as well. The row wheels are attached to the VVS suspension via a single Phillips fastener. These are also not Loctite in place, so removal is going to be, again, pretty straightforward. All you need is a good small Phillips screwdriver, and they just come right off like the way you see it here. There we go. Now towards the end of the build, I'm going to be adding a little drop of Loctite as well as some lubricant on the center portion here, just to give the tank some better performance. Actually, on second thought, when I said that the fasteners don't seem to have any Loctite, that doesn't seem to be the case, because there appears to be some small thread lock found on the intersections here, which again is actually a good move. With the Loctite, this should prevent the row wheels from undoing themselves while the tank is in operation. So kudos to Taigen for that design point. Also, a nice feature that the Taigen tank does have is that there is a brass bushing located on the center portion here of the die-cast road wheel. This is something important to keep in mind because you can easily lose these parts during the rebuild process, which is why I'm independently bagging all of the bushings and the fasteners in one bag, and the row wheels and rubber tires in a second. The tires themselves on the last Sherman were not glued on, and it appears that that's not the case on this one either. They just simply peel right off the rim here. Now, I don't believe that super gluing them is necessary. I believe I just put them on in the same way that you see them here on the last Sherman build that I've done, and it holds them on pretty well. These rubber tires are pretty snug once mounted to the rim. If they are loose on you, you could possibly just add a small little drop of CA just to keep them in place, but really I don't think that's necessary. Which is also a pretty good design cue, because in case you run in a situation where you accidentally damage one of the rubber tires or wears out prematurely for one reason or another, removing it and replacing it is pretty easy. You could just buy a bag of just the rubber tires themselves and just mount them over the wheels that you desire. So, with the row wheels off, you can see how much better access I have towards these fasteners that were mentioned before. And I'm going to now remove the idlers. The idlers, I want to stress out, should only be moved if you have the technique and the tools required to do this procedure. You see, unlike some of the other Sherman kits on the market, namely, I believe the Hen Long, where there's just a large coarse threaded bolt that holds the idler to the idler mount, on the Taigen it's done in a different manner. Here we have one of the idler covers removed, and now you can see the access that you're going to need to remove the idler wheel. On the Taigen, there's a T-pin that's held in place with a spring clip. This small little spring clip here is what's keeping everything together. So you have to carefully pry that off, and then the whole unit will slide off. It's a really effective method to keep the idlers on, but the problem is that little spring clip can easily fling off on its way to Lost Partia, and at that point there you're screwed. You're going to have to find a baggie of these parts. In fact, this exact same situation happened on my last M4A3 Taigen Sherman rebuild that I did a little while ago, and I mentioned it briefly in that video. So this is the type of thing that you should only do if you have the experience and the tools and even the replacement parts if needed to reinstall this component here. But with that in mind, on video I'm going to go ahead and get these pieces taken off. So let me start with the unit on this side. The piece is held in place with a simple plastic cover cap, which of course is going to be recycled, and they are glued in place. On this one here, this one just popped right off. Seems like they didn't use a whole lot of glue. This one here looks like they used a little bit more adhesive to keep it in place, so obviously this is going to be something that's going to be different per individual unit that you're working on. So with a screwdriver, I just went ahead and just pried a little bit into the piece here just to crack loose the glue, and I could, with a needle nose, I could just pry it off. Well, looks like I broke the unit, but that's perfectly alright because it's going to be re-glued in place, you know, as the build progresses. But with this now removed, I could get access to the spring clip. Okay, with the camera readjusted, let me go ahead and get the spring clip off. The best way to do so is to rotate it in a way where it can slide off, and I'm going to have it go downward. Now I'm going to have this cup over here that's going to hopefully catch the spring clip when it flies off. Now I'm pretty sure I'm going to be flooded in the comment section on all these other tips and techniques on how to do it, but on my build this is kind of the way I like to go about it. So with the plier, hopefully I'm not covering up the lens, so it's going to be tricky to get this in the component as well as get it on camera. So let's go ahead and you have to pry it evenly. There we go. Okay, so it looks like it's just dangling on the part now. There we go. All right. Once that is off, the entire idler wheel can be removed. Once the rear idler wheel is off, you can see that first and foremost that Taigen has a ball bearing system here, which is actually a very nice feature, and this was true on the other Sherman as well. But you're not done yet. You see, now you have to remove the hubcap. The reason why the hubcap has to be removed is because you notice that there's this travel that this axle has in a linear motion. Why this is relevant and important is because when it comes time to remount the unit, if I try to line it up and push it in, you'll see what happens. The axle will slide into the wheel before it will emerge from the other end here. So you have to prevent that from happening. Obviously, you're not going to be able to get this unit remounted in place. So the best way to do this is you're going to have to remove the hubcap so that when it comes time for the reinstallation, you can have a screwdriver pushing on the inside portion of the pin, and when you slide it in, it'll all go in as one unit. Now, the hubcap, I believe, is either pressure fit on or it's glued on, and to remove it, it's actually done in a pretty simple and rudimentary way. Let me show you. And to knock the hubcap off, all you need is a hard metal object. I'm using my bench vise here that I closed the jaws on, giving me a nice flat surface. And I'm just going to take the row wheel with a nice even holding and just thwack it directly onto the metal surface. This in turn is going to push the pin inward, which will then knock the hubcap off in one swift motion. Looks something like this. And there you go. Here's the hubcap. And there's the pin. Now, a few people out there are going to be wondering, well, can't you just do the same trick with a screwdriver or a plier? Just try to get a screwdriver here and try to pry or yank it up. This will just more than likely lead to you marring and damaging up the hubcap or the rear idler itself. As you notice with this step over here, it is completely damage free and it just popped right off. Reinsertion is probably going to require me to free up some tolerances a little bit with a Dremel, but I'll touch upon more about that later. The next bit of equipment I'm going to remove is going to be the little latch that's used to open up the upper and lower hulls. Now, this is going to seem a little strange to most people out there because I'm not going to be replacing this whatsoever. I'm just going to be amputating it completely. The reason is because, unfortunately on the Sherman, under this location over here, we have the Little Joe auxiliary generator exhaust, and this is a detail I'm going to be adding, not to mention a few other little fixings that are going to be going on in this area over here. And because of that, this unit here is in the way of it. So in order to bump up the vehicle's accuracy, this latch here's got to go. Now, I'm not going to mess with the actual latch itself. This component here is still going to be kept, and the tank is still going to come apart or be kept together in the same manner. It's just that rather than using this extended lever with a small screwdriver or with my finger, I'm just going to have to go in here and just open the part up manually. Now, this might seem to be a bit of an inconvenience, but keep in mind, once the vehicle progresses past this point, it's going to have a recharge jack on the model so that I'm not going to have to really open the tank up other than for real emergencies. So with that in mind, this extended latch here is just not necessary. The latch itself is just held in place with a single Phillips screw. And it even has its own little bushing. The piece itself is nicely designed and engineered, but it's just not necessary for this build. The next bit of equipment that I'm going to remove and relocate involve these three fasteners that we have here. These three fasteners secure the speaker to the lower hull. Now, a few people are probably scratching their heads wondering, well, why is that even relevant? Well, it has to do with the recharge system that I just touched upon before. You see, one downside that these Shermans do have, and this is true for the Taigen and the Henlong, not sure about the Matto, but definitely true for the other two, is that the hatches that are on the top deck are molded solid to the upper hull, and the turret has so much equipment shoved on the inside that trying to use either of these locations for the recharge jack system is just not possible. So on the Sherman here, I devised this system where we're going to recharge the tank from the lower hull, and this is facilitated with the escape hatch detailing that is found on the real vehicle. With the system, you get the added detailing of the escape hatch, but you now have an access point to yank out the recharge system in order to charge up the tank without having to take it apart. Now, unfortunately, this location here is directly where the recharge jack escape hatch system is going to be mounted. So these three screws are going to have to go, and the speakers have to be relocated on another location on the inside of the vehicle. And this brings us now back to the four fasteners that we have here for the battery tray. These are going to be temporarily removed, altered, and then remounted permanently, just prior to the bodywork being done. One of the modifications I need to make to them is with their surfaces. If you run your finger along them, you'll feel a small hump on the bolt that is emerging from the side hull. This is going to be very problematic when it comes time for the bodywork because you're never going to be able to fully sand that off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove each of the bolts, flatten them with a file or on my bench grinder, just a small little amount of material. Then I could remount them to the vehicle, to which point they'll either be flush or preferably below the surface of the lower hull. Add them with some kind of a thread lock to prevent them from backing out. And then once they're in there permanently, I could then go ahead and do the bodywork procedure, blending everything in. Well, like you've just saw, I went ahead and moved the speaker from lying down flat to sitting vertically here on the tank's side armored hull. The adhesive was silicone, and this is a technique that I've used on many other builds, and it works really, really well. It holds the unit in place in a nice stern manner, but it's a temporary type adhesive where if I ever need to, I could just yank the piece off and it won't cause any damage to either the part or the model. I also used the silicone in order to secure the wires tucked in this location over here. This is going to clean things up specifically since this whole area over here is going to be dedicated for the spool of wire, which is going to be needed for the recharge jack. I also went ahead and added some more zip ties to the wires for the motors, again, just to keep everything nice and tucked as much as possible and in a nice clean manner. From this point here, I'm actually going to take these fasteners, which hold on the clamp, as well as the fasteners which secure the motor gearboxes to the hull. I'm going to remove them and remount them, but with a little drop of red Loctite. This is, again, another technique that I use on my builds, and it's just one as really an insurance policy, just to make sure that the fasteners don't loosen up as the tank is in operation. It's not so much important for the ones back here, but for the gearbox, it's definitely one that I like to personally do, because there are a lot more vibrations looking in this area here because of the motors and the gears, and with the torque of the tracks and everything, they can possibly work themselves loose, although truth be told, it is fairly uncommon, but it's one of those like insurance policy things where I have the model apart, you might as well do it. It's also at this time here where I would take and remove the stock gearbox and replace them with a steel aftermarket gearbox of one flavor or another. However, for this particular build, that's not going to be necessary because stock with the Taigen Sherman tank models, from what I've seen, they come with the steel ball bearing gearboxes already pre-installed. So that's one procedure that is just not going to be necessary. But again, I am still going to do the thread lock trick with the fasteners. So one addition that I make to all of my Sherman builds is with the addition of cast texturing to the front transmission cover. Of course, the Taigen model has the fender mounts molded into this section over here, but these are going to need to be deleted in order so I could mount on two fresh ones that are going to be fabricated out of thin strips of metal. Although this Taigen kit does have these sections molded in, they are a bit on the thicker end, which do make them way more robust, but for my needs, I like to go with the model to look more accurate, so the stock ones need to go in order to manufacture brand new ones, which means the molded ones on the fenders are amputated, as are the ones found on the transmission cover. With these removed, it's a nice smooth surface that I could add and apply the cast texturing to. In order to remove them, a Dremel with a high-speed removal bit was utilized, and I just simply ground off these sections in a nice even manner, which leaves for a nice smooth appearance that we see here. While working on adding the cast texturing to the various components found on this portion of the hull, namely the suspension housings as well as the front transmission cover, this now led me to something that I wanted to improve upon these Taigen tanks. You see, with the way the hull is designed, you have the inset here for the transmission cover where it makes contact with the hull. And this is true, by the way, on all Shermans. There is this drop-off point where the hull makes contact with the transmission cover because, of course, on the real one, the whole unit slides in place and then gets fastened to the vehicle. And it's that fastening is where this model here falls short, as well as most other 1/35 scale kits on the market. On the real tank, you would have a row of fasteners going from top to bottom on the hull over here, as well as you would have a blister that's integrally casted into the transmission cover, and there would also be some other fasteners found these places as well. In fact, if you watch my 1/6 scale Sherman rebuild videos, I tend to talk about this in more depth. However, like I just mentioned, on all of the 1/16 scale radio control tanks, it's not just true for the Taigen, but the same can also be applied to Tamiya, Matto, as well as even Henlong. The detailing that I just mentioned is always absent. Well, for this model here, I wanted to go ahead and address that, so I went ahead and designed this set that we have here. This set here is a new addition to the East Coast Armory 1/16 scale catalog, and it supplies you with not just the fasteners in order to give you the lateral rows that I mentioned before, but it also gives you the blisters that we have on either side. The set here is made from HD 3D printings, and the component gives you more than enough fasteners to supply and rig out all of the detailing found on these portions here, plus several others as spares in case one or two may get lost or possibly broken during the course of the tank's construction and or operation. At this time of the build, I like to remove the exhaust deflector grille, which is integrally built into the top upper hull, and mount it to the lower hull sponsons, which have been extended with the ECA hull sponson extender set. If you look on the ECA channel, you'll see some of my previous 1/16 scale RC Sherman builds where I take the stock unit and I mount it to the portion, but I go ahead and modify it by milling out the back portions, allowing the smoke to funnel through in a more realistic manner. You see, to Taigen's credit, they actually redesigned the component. On the exhaust deflector grille that are found on earlier examples of the Taigen M4A3, as well as on both past and present versions of the Henlong M4A3, and I believe this is also true for the Matto as well, the unit itself more or less resembles the old school Tamiya 1/35 scale M4A3 Sherman grill, where if you know anything about that kit, the grill is present, but it's a bit on the simplistic end. The M4A3 flip grill had a bit more to it in its overall geometry, as well as some other finer details. These are absent on those older versions, but are found on the redesigned piece. Now, although this sounds really, really good, and is something that some people are saying, well, John, why isn't that you're using this on this build? Well, unfortunately, one bad thing that this has is that although the piece does have for all intents and purposes, the appropriate shape, size, and even the detailing with the way the grills are laid out, the problem with this unit is that it's really, really hard, if not impossible, to mill these areas out in order to hollow them out for the smoke to funnel through. So much so that rather than trying to rework this unit here, I decided to outright replace it with a new unit that I designed myself. This one here is a 3D printed component. It's a new addition to the ECA product line, and if you'll look on this one, it is completely hollow through and through. It has all the appropriate detailing that are found on this one here, as well as I used my 1/6 scale metal version really as a basis in order to scale down to this 1/16 counterpart. All the fins are present. They all have their appropriate curvature to them. The bulkheads are in their appropriate location and also have their appropriate geometry. The one here on the left-hand side is just a straight line, while this one here, it goes kind of in a zigzag format, and the one on top serves double duty, acting as both a bulkhead to support the fins, but it also has a retractable lever, which on the real unit would swing out, which will give you a little bit of leverage to pivot this unit in place, getting it out of the way so you get access to the rear engine hatch found on the M4A3. In addition to this detailing here, you'll also see that the portion has its cutouts in their appropriate locations. And you'll see the little locking lever found on this grill. Like I mentioned before, this unit would pivot out of the way, and you would use this locking lever to secure it to the tank's back shelf, which works basically like a door latch. You just push it in, it holds it in place, and it prevents this thing from swinging down and clunking you in the face. Comparing this to the stock Taigen one, the Taigen one does have some pretty good detailing on it overall. However, if you compare it to the ECA one, you can see how the ECA one is more improved. Another thing I want to point out that the ECA one dimensionally is basically identical to the original Taigen one, so this can be a drop in replacement. However, you are going to have to make some modifications on how to secure it to the tank. If you are using the stock method where this is built into the top upper hull, you are going to have to make some modifications to the ECA one. However, the ECA one is more or less designed to be like the real unit, which will swing and be mounted to the sponson sections which emerge from the hull. Like I mentioned before, those pieces are a resin set from eastcoastarmory.com and mount directly to the back end of the Taigen tanks, which have this detailing missing. This unit here, once mounted to the ECA piece, can be designed to pivot and function. However, for my 1/16 scale build, I'm just going to mount it in the static position because having it function on a model this scale is not really that necessary in my opinion. But if you're some crazy mad lad out there that wants to have all the functionality at your fingertips, this here is a great way to achieve that. Well, as the build goes along, you can see how it's evolving. I'll touch upon the upper hull in a moment, but here you can see the lower sections. The recharge jack has been fitted, as well as the magnetic escape hatch that we have on the bottom. The hull, of course, has also been fully coated with its base coat of OD. Notice here on the front we have those fasteners that I mentioned earlier. And you can see exactly how much this fills in this area compared to the stock rendition. Of course, all the welds were added previously. And you can also see how the seam removal was concluded on the VVSS system. On the back portion, you can see that the new exhaust deflector grille has been fitted. And in order to fit this on, I basically mount on the upper hull, and I manually adjust the grille to the point where it's at its proper height. Once it's set, a few drops of CA, and the unit is ready to go. Really, all that remains to be added now are the rear idlers, the idler mounts, as well as the sprockets. At this point here, the lower hull is pretty much done. So this brings our attention now to the upper hull. As you can see, since the previous scenes, the upper hull has been thoroughly gutted, and I went ahead and removed all of the detailing, which I'm either going to replace with my own resin or 3D printed components, or I plucked off the tools which are going to be painted separately and mounted towards the end of this build. This is customary on all these builds that I work on. Once all of these components are removed, you'll notice that there is going to be some bodywork that I'm going to need to do to these areas here, but of course this is going to follow. Along with the tool removal, I also ground off the stock fuel filler caps. I have my resin replacement ones, and the reason for that is going to be touched upon later in this video. The bow periscopes were also amputated because, again, I have 3D printed replacements that are far superior in detailing compared to the stock molded in ones, so these also were pitched, as well as the little handles that were integrally molded into the various locations. Note, I went ahead and drilled these out with a pin vise. So this is going to prep the surface for me to add the metal handles, which are going to also be better in detailing compared to the stock originals. On the rear portion here, you can see that I completely removed the folding rack, but unlike the other 1/16 Shermans that I've done before, I also went ahead and removed the track racks. Why did I do this? Well, that's because I went ahead and designed a replacement 3D printed set for these components that I'm going to be touching on in a few minutes. On the side of the hull here, you'll notice that the molded and fender mounts are completely blended away and removed. Not just true for the sides, but also for the rear as well. The molded in ones are very basic in their overall detailing, and on my builds I like to remove them and replace them with a piece made from thin strip styrene, which does give a better overall look, and it really does enhance the model compared to leaving it stock. However, if you want to keep the molded-in one for one reason or another, it is simplistic, by the way, and it's less of a thing to worry about with it breaking. So if you want to keep the molded-in one, you can do that. All you got to do is basically just enhance it by drilling out the sections with a pin vise, and you should have the detailing, which is absent on the stock Henlong and Taigen M4A3 Shermans. However, for my model here, I'm going to go full Monty, so I'm going to go ahead and replace it with a strip of styrene, like I stated before. To remove all of the components I just mentioned, this was done via the high-speed removal bit on my Dremel here. This is the smaller version of the bit. There is a larger version, and it can do the same task. However, for these tighter confines here, the smaller bit is a better choice for that. When wielding this tool, you use it basically like an end mill on a milling machine. If anyone's a machinist, you'll know what I'm talking about. The bit does a fantastic job with removing the material that is intended, but you don't over-remove, leaving for a pit or a gouge that needs to be filled in with extra bodywork. Of course, some bodywork is going to be required, but it's a lot less compared to some other methods that are out there. When I'm using the bit, like specifically here on the side sections, I use my thumb as a guide, and while the machine is running at full speed, I basically just run it along these sections over here. Just like on a mill, you don't want to over dig into it, you just want to remove thin layers at a time until finally the object is fully removed. As you can see, it did a really good job with removing the sections, and then after some polishing with some sandpaper, I was able to get the surface that you see here. For these portions, the bit is nice and flat, so you basically just, again, with small thin little layers of removal, you just go ahead and polish it away until finally you bottom out on the surface, and it just goes around and it just removes any sort of material that's still remaining, that sticks above the surface here of the model. Well, with all that out of the way, it's now time for me to get on the bodywork. This here is just going to be addressed with some simple red putty. However, these bigger areas here are going to require a little bit more work as opposed to the thinner surface gouges that I just touched upon. Because of these large sections that were plucked out, red putty alone is not going to work because you need some kind of a base for the putty to sit upon. So in order to fill these areas in, the best way to do it is with strips of scrap sheet styrene. Had some sections just lying around the shop, so might as well recycle them for this purpose. Basically, you trim them to shape, and then you glue them onto the inside. When this is done, you will have the backing, which will be a fantastic surface to add the putties and the other filler on top of it, which will then allow you to smooth everything over and sand it down flush. Once the lower extremities are fully painted, it is then time to remount on the rear idlers. Now, I already touched upon earlier in the video the process of removal, and from here it's just basically just do everything but in reverse. The only prep work that I do before the remounting of the wheels, that I take a pin vise with this bit over here, and I use it to just go ahead and eat away at the layers of paint that have now built up on the inner hole that we have right here for the axle. Fortunately, I don't know the size of the bit offhand, but it's just basically the type of bits that you find just about any, like drill bit assorted pack. The important thing is that the bit needs to be the exact same size as the shaft. If it's slightly bigger or if it's too small, it's not going to have the needed effect. If it's bigger, well then you're going to have the adverse effect and you're going to hog out material on the idler mount here, which is going to cause some problems. So you want to make sure it's the exact same size. If it is, just go ahead and go up and down these recesses over here, just lightly, just enough so that the layers of paint and paint only get removed. Once it's done, the axle should just slide directly into its appropriate location. After the holes are taken care of, it's then time to secure on the axle. Now, one little extra thing that I like to do is with a little smear of grease, I like to put it on the bearing section here of the axle. This is the portion where the road wheel will actually rotate on, and because of that, it is a wear point. So just to give a little bit more performance out of my builds, as well as a little bit more longevity, I go ahead and just smear a little grease in that area there. You don't want to overdo it, just a nice little dab will do you. You then just drop it into its appropriate location, seat it in fully, and then from here we could go ahead and index it into its mounting hole. Once the unit is pushed all the way in, it's then time to secure back on with the spring clip. Installation of the spring clip is a two-hand operation. The first hand is going to be putting pressure on the axle, preventing it from sinking in during the installation procedure. With the way the axle is designed, there's a small little milled-in slot found on the surface, and this is the area that the spring clip needs to clip onto. If that little area is not present, you're not going to be able to really snap the piece into its appropriate location. The other hand is going to be, well, snapping on the actual clip itself, and that's best done with a tool like a pair of needle nose pliers like this one here, or something similar to that. You need something that's strong and metal to put pressure onto the spring clip so that it overcomes the spring tension for it to wrap around the cylindrical piece and clip in where it needs to go. As for the spring clips themselves, if there was ever a component that was very easily lost or something that just loves to fling off to Lost Partia, it would be these spring clips, which is why I strongly recommend having a number of them in your possession, specifically if you do a lot of rebuilds like I do, or if you just want to have a baggie on hand for a rainy day what-if situation. The spring clips, fortunately, are really easily come by and are really affordable. They can be found on just about any RC car vendor. In fact, I have a little baggie over here filled with them that I picked up a number of years ago off of eBay from, again, some RC vendor. But since I purchased this set over here, in recent years, Taigen themselves offer little baggies of the replacement spring clips, which, again, it's a really good thing to have in your toolbox in case you own one of these models or, like me, you do a lot of rebuilds on them. And after the spring clip is applied, the idler is now back into its appropriate location, and once remounted, I just simply reinstall the kit-supplied idler mount detail covers. Along with the rear idlers, the front sprockets need to be remounted as well. Only unlike the rear idlers, where I kept the stock original ones, for the sprockets, these had to be swapped out because of the Matto tracks, and I'm utilizing in place of the stock kit ones. Swapping out these stock tracks is a simple procedure. However, when you do so, you also need to swap out the sprocket because the Taigen sprocket will not time with the Matto track. The Matto sprockets will fit onto the Taigen axle like you see here, and the piece will just drop in place as it would with the other counterpart. However, one modification that needs to be done by the builder in order to secure them in place is with the fastener securing hole. You see, the Taigen model utilizes a single M4 cap screw along with a lock washer to keep everything in place. The Matto utilizes a similar design, only the fastener is smaller compared to the one on the Taigen, so out of the box, the pieces will not be able to fit. To adapt the sprocket to fit onto the Taigen model, you do have to enlarge the center hole, and this is done with a larger diameter drill bit. The drill bit in question is a 5/32 drill bit, and it's secured here into my drill press. The drill press is probably the best way to drill this piece out because it keeps the bit in a nice, straight, squared manner, and it'll prevent the hole from being drilled in a canted fashion. However, if you do not have a drill press, the same procedure can still be done with a hand drill. But if you are using a hand drill, keep in mind that you want to be paying attention to the squareness of the drill, because with the hand drill, you can have a tendency to drill it in a oblong manner. Having said that, the hole isn't really that important to get perfectly squared away because that's not really what aligns it onto the axle of the gearbox. That is really more or less done with the geometry of the inner portion that we have here, as well as on the spindle itself. The hole is really there just to keep the fastener in place for it to secure it and keep it tight against the unit. So if the piece is not perfectly square, you're going to be okay by and large. But just for the purposes that I have the tooling, I'm just going to go ahead and use the drill press like you see here. As you can see, the drill press makes really short work of the drilling, and from here we can now mount it to the vehicle in the same way as it was originally intended. To secure the sprocket in place, I'm going to first take the inner sprocket, that's the version that has the wider shank section, with that little inset right over there, and just match it to the sweet spot here found on the sprocket axle. When you hit a certain point, it should just drop directly into its location. From there, what I like to do is add a few little drops of super glue on the other matching end of the sprocket, just so when it gets tightened in place, everything stays where it needs to be. This is really an optional technique. You don't have to do it, but it's one that I personally like doing. If, by the way, you ever need to take the sprocket off for one reason or another, the super glue does not permanently adhere everything together. So if you need to pop it off for whatever reason, a simple thwack with a rubber mallet and the piece should give way. With the glue added, you just again find that magic sweet spot with the sprocket and press the piece in. Then finally, of course, it's time to add the retention screw. For this, I am going to use a drop of Loctite in order to keep the piece in place and to prevent it from loosening up when the vehicle is in operation. For the Loctite, in the past, I've used red, but I've also used blue from time to time. The blue Loctite, in my opinion, is a little bit better than the red for this application because for whatever reason, if you need to remove the sprocket, the blue stuff will give way long before the red does. But having said that, the red stuff will still give way, specifically if you don't use that much, which is key, by the way, when adding the Loctite to these fasteners. For this one here, I'm just going to roll with the blue. The Loctite I am using is Permatex, as you can probably clearly see. Just you know, throwing that out there in case anyone's interested in picking this stuff up. I picked it up from my local auto store, but the same stuff can probably be found on Amazon. With the access wiped off, I could go ahead and secure this to the model. And again, it just gets installed as simply as it was removed. And you basically stop when the fastener bottoms out. You don't want to over-tighten these pieces here, just enough so the fastener tightens up to the point where it doesn't want to spin any further, and then the Loctite will just do the rest. Once the sprockets are installed, you do have to make a slight modification to the end faces. The first modification that I made was a detail one, and you'll notice that I went ahead and added this little divot here to the center portion of each of the sprocket spindles. This is present on the real vehicle, but is absent on the molded Matto tooling. The next modification involves how the pieces get secured. On the Matto, the section here is threaded, and it lines up and then just threads onto the sprocket. However, when you mount it to a Taigen, that's not going to be the case because of the larger fastener. It uses up that little well area that would be for this center section. So for this one here, you do have to make a modification. That is to amputate the section here of the threads. This is going to be done with the bandsaw, and then once the pieces are cut off, I'll be able to sand down any burrs that remain, and then the unit will simply get glued to the front face over here of the sprocket. This is going to be adhered on with silicone because, like I mentioned in many of my videos, this you want to be a temporary type mounting, so if whatever reason happens you need to get access to the sprocket, the pieces should be able to pop off, and the silicone's a great way to hold it on in a semi-permanent manner, where it keeps it on nice and secure during operation, but if you ever want to take it off, the piece can easily be removed. Once the nubs are amputated, I just polish the area down with a file, getting it to the nice smooth appearance that we have here. From this point onward, I could get them installed to the model, but not before I go ahead and get these units primed. Once they're fully primed, I can then fit them in place and continue with the remainder of the build. I did say before that I was going to use a bandsaw to cut these sections off, which can be done, but the pieces do heat up pretty quickly when using that procedure. Another method, and it's probably easier than using the bandsaw, is to simply just use a hacksaw. The caveat is that you need to have a good vise. You secure the unit in the vise, and by unit I mean by the nub, because obviously you're not going to care about the threads anymore, and then from there you can just use the hacksaw to cut the piece directly off. Once the piece is removed, again you run the surface up and down either on some sandpaper or a file, and then from there you're ready for installation. With the nub removed, you can see exactly how flat the unit's going to fit onto the sprocket, and the piece looks like the way it should. And after the hubcaps are primed, I went ahead and add some globs of silicone to these three areas here on the sprocket. These three areas are those sections that are molded in that act as the stops to prevent the hubcap from bottoming out. Once the silicone is added, the hub just goes directly into place, and then from here I just step away and allow the silicone to set. As for the hubs on the rear idlers, these are just the kit ones and were simply applied without any sort of extra adhesive. With the way the pieces were painted, there's just so many layers of paint and primer built up on these sections that they just went on and are held in place with sheer friction. However, if the pieces do seem to be a little loose, a little drop of white glue or silicone should be enough to anchor the parts in place and prevent them from falling out. And here's the upper hull going through its detail modifications. At this point here, my usual detail techniques are starting to come into fruition, and you can see that with the layer of cast texturing that has been applied. For those who don't know, on the late pattern Shermans, this entire area here was one integral casting, and this was due to the complex shape needed for the hatch wells, the hinges, as well as the other amenities, like the antenna base mount, as well as the backup periscopes. The kit does a good job with the bulbous nature found on these pieces, and they also have some traces of cast texturing intermittent around the pieces, which is a nice touch. However, for my builds, in order to improve it further, I go ahead and add a layer of cast texturing just to really make sure that the piece looks like the pieces are actually casted, which would be seen, of course, on the real vehicle. For the texturing itself, it's my typical technique using the red glazing spot putty, and I have referenced it in a few other videos where I actually showed the technique and how I actually apply it. So I recommend checking that out in case anyone's interested in doing a technique similar to this. With the texturing done, it's now time for me to add the welds, which on the sides here I'm going to be using my typical epoxy sculpt method. But besides that, I'm also going to be doing something a bit different and new, and this is something I haven't done before on any of my 1/16 scale Shermans, and I know for a fact it's something that no one has ever done on their 1/16 scale Sherman builds. And that involves the rear grille work. You see, all M4A3s in model form, be it in 1/35 scale, 1/72 scale, 1/6 scale, they generally have the grille works rendered in this type of format, where we have the two hatches, you have the various slats running up and down, and then horizontally you have these 3 bars. The 3 bars, if you take a look at it and you don't know any better, you'll say, well, oh, those are 3 bar pieces of steel that the little sections then weld to. And if you think that, well, you're wrong. The real M4A3 do not have bars in these locations. In fact, these 3 locations are actually 3 weld beads. With the way the grille work is designed, you have the slats, and then all the slats are held in place by just running a welding rod up and down these locations in these 3 areas, thus solidifying them and keeping them where they need to be. On the smaller scale models, in order to simplify this for the tooling and the injection molding process, they go ahead and oversimplify it to resemble bars. It works on smaller scale models, it's one of those things that gets by, but it's one of those things that I always seem to want to improve on my builds. Not so much my 135s, but on my 1/6 scale tanks, for instance, you will not see me use bars for my grille work. For my smaller scale builds, I generally don't really mind the way the pieces are molded, and I tend to leave them on models that are, 1/35 scale and smaller. However, even in the past on some of my other 1/16s, I left it as well. But for this one here, I'm going to try something a bit different. I'm going to go ahead and further enhance these, and I'm going to utilize the technique that I'm going to show in a moment. The technique is basically the same technique that I use on smaller 1/35 scale models that I add sculpted weld beads to. And this is a slightly different procedure than I use for my main armor welds that are going to be sculpted later on. The material is also going to be different. The reason why is that for welds of this small size, I prefer this technique as opposed to the other epoxy that I use for the main welds. If I'm not mistaken, I believe I actually showcased this technique in another video, but in case anyone missed it, I'll just go ahead and go over it again in this video here. First, you'll see that the area has all been masked up with the exception of these 6 locations. These are where the weld beads gotta go, and the tape is basically going to act as a margin and preventing any sort of overlap that the sculpted weld bead is going to have on the areas where I don't want the welds. For the material, I'm going to be utilizing my red putty. It's the same red putty that I touched upon before for the sculpt, or for the cast sculpt, and I use it for this type of technique as well. To actually sculpt the welds, I'm going to be utilizing my miniature box cutter / X-Acto knife that I have here, and I'm also going to be utilizing a small little amount of paint thinner, and you'll see why once I get to the sculpting process. Okay, well, let's go ahead and dig right in. Here I have the paint thinner put into this small little cap that I have here. In order to put the putty on, I'm just going to smear it on with my finger, and you want a very thin amount. You don't want too much, just a good little smear is really all you need. So, just like so. I'm going to repeat to the other two. Now this putty does dry pretty quick, so you are on the clock when it comes time for applying it in very thin sections. So once the putty's added, I'm going to go ahead and dip my knife blade into the paint thinner, and now I'm just going to go ahead and etch my weld lines. Hopefully that comes out on camera. Let me do the same thing to the other two. If you come across a location where there's not enough putty, don't worry about it, just rub it in, and you can just add a quick little smear. Once it's dry, it should look something like this. So, once the putty's all sculpted, this stuff, like I say, dries really quick, specifically when it's applied in a really thin manner like you see here. And, well, I guess I could start with the peeling process. And there we go. You can see with the tape removed, it did a really good job in keeping the putty where it needs to be. And you can see now that the piece has a better accurate appearance as opposed to having that the presence of bar stock like I touched upon before. And now you actually have the proper welds which would be seen on the grill work. As the build chugs on, here we have the upper hull, and at this point here it's basically ready for painting. There are one or two extra details that I'm going to be adding, but these will be mounted on the model shortly after the filming of this scene. Jumping to the rear portion of the model, we have some details that have been pre-existing catalog items as well as some new additions. The pre-existing catalog item would be the folding rear rack. This is a 3D printed component and has been listed on the ECA catalog now for a little while. This set here is offered in two different flavors. We have the fully deployed state, and there's also the full function version. The fully deployed version is this one, and it's the same version that I touched upon in my other Taigen M4A3 rebuild video. Even though the unit is rendered in the open state, it still has some functionality to it where the whole piece can hinge upward. And by the way, currently it's not glued on, which is why it's a little loose, but this will be seen in better detail or in better light after the model's fully painted. Anyway, you can see that the piece can hinge upward, and also the staves are not present. The staves are something that needs to be scratchable. This component here is scaled down from the 1/6 scale ECA 3D printed full function set, and because of that you inherit all of the surface detailing that is found on that larger scale counterpart. All of these details are just not present on the stock Taigen tooling. Some of the details that carried over from the 1/6 scale counterpart would be the little wing nuts that are found on either side. These wing nut straps are meant to keep the rack in its closed state when not in use. Also present are the tie-down strap mounts that are found along the top as well as the bottom of the rack. These are used to prevent whatever is being lugged around in your rack from falling off when the vehicle's in operation via the use of tie-down straps, which by the way is generally something that is overlooked on many builds that are out there. The remainder of the fittings are also better rendered out, such as the folding straps, which do a better job with mimicking the ones found on the real counterpart, as well as also with the remainder of the geometry itself. The real rack would be made from stamped sheet metal, and the 3D printed component here does a better job in replicating that compared to the stock rack that is, again, supplied with the model. The hinges are also appropriately rendered with the ones on the inside as well as the ones on the top portion, and they do have the appropriate hinge segment detailing, their well detailing, and also their fastener detailing that is present. On the rear portion over here, we have the little backstop, which prevents the unit from bottoming out. And on the underside, we do have the stave mounts with their appropriate segments that are present. The stave mount on the opposite side is also hinged. And here I have the component right here. The piece does have its, again, appropriate detailing on it, but this will be secured to the rack after the unit is fully painted and when the staves have been fully scratch built. Like I stated before, this set here is offered in two different flavors. We have here the fully deployed state as well as the full function version. The full function version is literally just the 1/6 scale one shrunk down to 1/16. Because of that, not only do you have the same functions as this one over here where it could tilt upward as well as with the staves, but that one goes a step further with having the wing nuts able to move around and the little struts here able to bend inward, allowing the whole unit to fold up in place. On my build, I prefer to just have this one here and to just leave it at that, but there are some people out there who are braver than I am, and if that's you, that set there is an option. However, I do want to mention that both of these sets, but specifically the other one, are very, very frail and fragile because of the HD material that they are rendered in. If you're the type of person that likes to take your models out and just abuse them and run them hard, these pieces here are really not going to be for your liking, and if you're that type of a person, I recommend just keeping the stock Taigen pieces. However, if you are looking for something with higher detail fidelity and you don't run your models too hard, perhaps these 3D printed components here could be something to look into. Aside from the rear rack here, another new addition that was also scaled down from the 1/6 scale counterpart are the rear VVSS spare track racks. The VVSS M4A3 Shermans do have this component found on the back, and it's something that's basically a staple found on this pattern of vehicle. The model, of course, does have these pieces present, however, just like with the rack and the other details that are found on the supplied model, are a bit basic in their overall shape and appearance. These components here, I went ahead and recently tooled up and are a new addition to the ECA catalog. And these components here, like I stated before, are literally my 1/6 scale ones, just shrunk down to 1/16. These drop directly into place once you remove the stock counterparts. These sets here will work on either the Taigen or the Henlong version of the 1/16 M4A3. The pieces just mount in place. However, when you're mounting them, what I like to do, and this is true by the way for the 1/6 scale ones, is to make sure that they are aligned properly. You take two of the spare track links and you fit them in place. This will act as a jig, keeping the piece nice and square, because obviously if it's canted, it's going to lead to some problems. As for the piece themselves, the stock track links just slide right in. And the track links that I'm using for this one are going to be the Mantle tracks, which are the best in this regard because they better replicate the real VVSS track. The Mantle ones are just a track pad with the two holes that are present, much along the lines of the real unit, while both Henlong and Taigen tracks have the tooth molded in, which is something that hurts the look of the piece, and if you're using those pieces, you cannot use these track racks that I have on this model. Also, the track racks, since they are based on the 1/6 scale one, have all of the appropriate detailing and geometry to them, and also have their weld beads integrally printed on. Just like with the rack, these are made in HD materials, so they are very nicely rendered, but again, are on the frail and fragile end, just like with the rear rack that I touched upon before. The units are also technically functional in that you can see that the hinge work is present on the bottom portion, and I have the straps right here in the hand. The hinge is found, but as you can see, it's very, very tiny, and with the combination of this material here is something that can be made to function with a small little pin, but realistically, it's something that can break very, very easily. So much so that I'm just going to say it's not really meant to be functional. Basically, the way these are designed is that you paint the model, you secure the tracks in place after the model's heading towards the finish line, and then just simply secure the straps where they need to go. Once they're secured to the model, you're basically done. The advantage that this has, though, over the stock ones is that when everything is molded in, it looks blockier and chunkier in shape, as opposed to having everything rendered separately, which gives you a little bit more detail fidelity. There is another set out there. It's very similar to this from Mantle, where these pieces basically do the same thing but are made in die-cast metal. Those are a viable set. However, in my opinion, they're a bit overscaled, again, due to the functionality that needs to be built into the piece to keep them robust. If you are looking for functionality as well as also a bit more ruggedness, perhaps that might be the option to roll with. But for my model here, I'm just going to use these pieces that we have right here. When getting to the turret, probably one of the biggest areas to improve on the model is with the mantlet. The mantlet itself is actually pretty decently rendered. It does have some slight cast texturing integrally molded into the die cast, and the shape and overall geometry of the piece is pretty good. However, two places where the mantlet falls short is with the ports for both the coaxial machine gun as well as the visor. On the model here, you'll notice that both of these insets are the exact same size, while on the real 76mm turret, this one here would be much larger in size compared to the one for the coax. Fortunately, with the way the piece is modeled, both of the holes are modeled after the pattern for the machine gun. So expanding this hole here is not going to be very difficult. Another interesting quirk that the model has built in is with the flashing bulb for the machine gun. The model has the machine gun flash on this port over here, which would be for the optic. While, of course, like I just said, the other one would be right over here for the 1919. The other hole on the model here is used for the indication light for the airsoft feature. As we all know, these 1/16 scale tanks have a little red LED in them that light up when the airsoft is firing. So, in order to improve this, you're going to need to go ahead and swap out the two LEDs so that the flashing bulb is on this side here of the mantlet, while the indicator LED is on this side. And here we have the pieces for the new EastCoastArmory.com 3D printed M1919 detail set. What this supplies you with are two sections of the M1919. We have a longer one, a shorter one, as well as we also have the insert here for the mantlet that would have the optic section fitted in place. What this set does is that it accomplishes twofold. First, it allows you to mount on the LEDs in the appropriate locations, because if you try mounting them as per the model, you are going to have that unsightly large LED protruding from both of these locations, and that does hurt the look of the model. And the second thing that it does is that it supplies you with the appropriate detailing, which is just absent on the model, again, with its stock configuration. Starting with the longer one, you'll notice that it's currently been pre-painted because this is about to be mounted to the hull, but you can see the details that are present on this piece. We have the entire ventilated barrel shroud for the M1919, along with the appropriate detailing found on the booster cap section. This component here is printed hollow, which will allow the flashing light to pass all the way through, which will give you the light simulation that is still present on the model. Now, this one here is for the bow machine gun. That's why it is longer compared to the other one that I'll touch upon in a moment. You see, with the way the Taigen kit and the Henlong kit is equally as guilty in this, with the way their barrel detailing is rendered is more or less reminiscent of an MG34, because again, both Taigen and Henlong are just recycling parts from their parts bin that are used on their other models, namely, of course, their Tiger 1. By replacing it with this unit here, you have the appropriate detailing of the Browning 1919, but the piece is still fully functional with no other modifications to add to this piece from this point onward. If we've watched several of the other 1/16 scale USAFE builds that I've done in the past on this channel, you'll note that generally I would have to get a photo etch or a brass 1919 set and make some revisions and modifications to it in order to achieve the same result. With this one here, all you gotta do is yank out the flashing LED from the stock model and just swap this one in place, and this piece will get inserted directly into the hull. And that's why it has these cutouts over here, so that it could insert without any other problems. Outside of the bow 1919, we also have here the mantlet 1919. It's the exact same CAD file, only this one here it's much shorter, and we just have the detailing present for the booster section. Why this is the case is because on all Sherman tank variants, only the tip section of the 1919 emerges from the mantlet. This is a very, very common mistake I've seen on a lot of builds, more builds than I really can keep count of, where they screw up by having a standard length barrel 1919 like this one here, sticking out like this from their mantlet. If you do that, congratulations, you're wrong. And I'm pretty sure someone's going to point out a photograph where this was the case, but that's actually not an M1919. The weapon that you're seeing in those images is actually a Browning A&M 250, which, although looks similar to the 1919, it's actually much bigger. And because that the 1919 and the M2 receivers are basically the same size, they can fit inside of the mounts from one another, which requires very little of any modifications. This was something that was done towards the end of the war, and you will also see several M2HB 50 caliber machine guns mounted in this section as well. However, generally that's not the case. You have a 1919 as the coax machine gun, and with the length and with the way everything is mounted inside, only the bare tip will emerge. On the T23 mantlet like this one here, basically almost none of the barrel section emerges from the mantlet, and so it's almost a flush fit. On the vehicles with the 75, it does stick out a little bit more, and basically sticks out to the extent that you see right here. This piece here is designed to be scaled appropriately, so no matter which mantlet you mount it in, you will have the appropriate barrel section emerging from the unit. Just like with the longer section, this one here is printed hollow. As you can see, the hole goes directly through, so no drilling is required on the user's end. The optic section is, well, less sexy compared to the two 1919s, but it does the exact same job in that the LED mounts to it, and it mounts to the mantlet, giving you a nice little standoff, as well as the appropriate detailing, which would be found on the part. So, in order to mount these, you are going to have to do some slight modifications to the mantlet. Not a whole lot, but just a slight mod specifically to the optic portion that we have here. The 1919 section is perfectly fine. No other mods need to be made to that. And in order to modify this, all you got to do is you have to drill this out slightly larger than it is on the kit one. To do that, let's go ahead and show you how this is accomplished. To actually drill the hole out, here mounted on my drill press I have a 1564 drill bit. These drill bits are found in just about any home improvement store, so tracking one down is not hard at all. The drill press is probably the best way to do this procedure. However, if a drill press is not had, you can do the same technique by just using a hand drill. Although you might want to be very careful with that, because when you're drilling with a hand drill, you may have the tendency on drilling the hole either oblong or off-center, and that can lead to some issues. With the drill press here, it's the best way to drill this out in a nice, precise manner. It's a little tricky to get the procedure on camera without me blocking with my hand, but we'll see how I can do with this. One thing about the material that the mantlet is made of, you don't need to add any oil to the bit in order to drill it out. It's just a quick procedure that's very simply done. Once removed, you can see that the insert mounts directly into place here. And on the outside, you do have the better size of the hole that would be present. From here, only thing I gotta do now is secure on the LED, and we're good to go. On the turret itself, in order to just get to the mantlet, you really do have to disassemble most of it. So the bottom portion of the turret just gets removed, and then the two fasteners that are found on either side here also are removed. Once those pieces are off, the whole mantlet just slides off along with the barrel. Fortunately, these are all held on with just fasteners, so the removal process is one that goes by very easily. On the section itself, you'll see that I already went ahead and made the modification by switching out the LEDs so that the indicator LED is on the appropriate side, as is the one for the coaxial machine gun. No other electrical work was done in this respect. In other words, I didn't have to snip anything, no soldering, none of that. I just yank out the two wires and put them in their appropriate locations. However, I do recall that on this one here, I did have to enlarge the hole just so that the larger LED can fit in place. This was done with a Dremel with, again, the high-speed removal bit, and you can see basically some of the residual left over from that procedure. Outside of that, that's really all the work that needs to be done in order to get the LEDs in their proper orientation. With the shorter 1919 removed off the sprue, you can see the LED size found on the inside, and this matches up perfectly with the one for the coax machine gun. It just drops directly in place, and you're good to go. Similar is also true for the other two LEDs. They basically fit right into place in a fairly snug manner. However, a drop of white glue or possibly some hot glue is really all that's needed to keep everything in place and to prevent anything from popping off on you as the model ages or as it just, goes through its operation. Before I can go ahead and get this fitted, however, I'm going to take this and the optic and paint them with a coat of flat black just to act as an insulator to prevent the pieces from glowing when the LEDs are functioning. Of course, with all these components being made out of HD 3D printed material, they are translucent in their opacity, and therefore the risk of glowing is something that can be encountered, but hopefully after a couple coats of flat black, that's not going to be the case. Once all the inserts are painted, it's then time for the installation. On the coax machine gun mount here, you can see that I added the dry brushing to this section at this time because, well, when the piece is secured in place, you're not exactly going to be able to get to it very easily to add the dry brushing. Also, with the way you see how it's sunk into the mantlet over there, this is something that's relatively easy to protect with some masking, so that'll protect it from any sort of overspraying when the rest of the model heads off into paint. Before I secure the coax nub in place, I just want to touch upon some of the mods that went to the mantlet itself. As you can see, the mantlet has progressed a little bit since the previous scenes. The number one thing that you will notice is that I went ahead and upgraded the cast texturing found on the surface. This is done with the same techniques that I've already touched upon in this video, as well as in some of the other videos that are found on this channel. And I also went ahead and airbrushed on the inside portion over here the base coat, so this will prevent any sort of areas that can potentially be left exposed once the model is fully assembled and painted, because trying to get in here with the paint is going to be a bit difficult, and you always run the risk of having areas that are missed because of the crevice-like nature on them. A similar procedure was also done on the rotor drum. Now the rotor drum, I didn't touch upon this before, but it is fully removable and just slides directly off of the main turret casting. This is great because this allows you easy access to take the unit apart, put it back together again, and also to get the piece in paint like I've done right over here. To install the machine gun, this is done with a few drops of super glue, and then basically you're all set. But one thing I do want to touch upon is with this little flat section that we have here on the printing. If you notice on the body here, it's a perfect cylinder, with the exception of this little flat. This flat here is there on purpose. On the mantlet, because of this protrusion that sticks out for the fastener, the flat is required just so that the piece can properly be seated in place where the barrel is as close to center as possible. For the installation, like I said, just a couple of drops of super glue. That's all that's really necessary. Make sure that the flat point indexes accordingly, and then just drop it right into place. Once the piece is seated, you can see exactly how much the mantlet is starting to progress and be a little bit more refined from the original kit variant. So with this now taken care of, you then reinstall the barrel. The barrel just slides directly into place, and by the way, the muzzle brake was removed prior to everything coming apart, and luckily the muzzle brake is not on, I found, with any sort of adhesive. It's just pressure fit in place. So this just drops right where it needs to go. No glue or anything is necessary. With the way it's designed, this little flat section here is going to correspond with a flat section found on the rest of the turret, which index it appropriately and prevents it from being able to rotate. Well, as things always seem to turn out, when I said before that the optic insert does not make contact with the top portion of the rotor, I was mistaken. It actually does, and the reason why I didn't think so is because I had it mounted upside down. But fortunately, you cannot put this on upside down with the way it's designed. So that means this piece here has went into a small little refit. I made the adjustments on this one over here, and the same adjustments have also been made on the CAD file. So the production versions of this set here will have this already addressed. Anyway, so now that this is out of the way, the next thing to do is to secure on the LEDs. This is best done with a drop of hot glue. You could super glue it in place, or you could possibly even use white glue. But for this one here, I'm just going to roll with hot glue because I've used this on several other builds in the past, and it always works out pretty well. After the two retention screws are remounted on with a drop of Loctite I shall add, the piece is then ready for reinstallation into the turret. Basically, just line everything up accordingly. Over here, there's a little track, and this is how the elevation system works on this one. So it's best try to keep the wires from tangling up in it. It's a little bit trickier to do on camera, but basically you line the peg into the track, and then the mantlet just slides into its securing point. You can add a drop of glue on either side here if you really want to hold it together, which is something I'm probably going to do. I also like to, by the way, permanently secure the bottom portion of the turret to the upper piece, because, you know, once I secure it together, I'm going to be doing body work, and I want to make it look as pristine as possible. This is doable, of course, but you have to keep in mind that when you do this is really a step of no return, so you want to thoroughly test everything to make sure it is fully functional. For my type of builds, the functionality of the turret is really not something that I spend a whole lot of time with. Like, for instance, I don't take these models out and put them in IR battles with other models. So really, they're display tanks that I can occasionally take out for a spin, and for that purpose, sealing up the turrets are perfectly fine. But if you want to, or if you're one of those type of people that like to always tinker with your models and add new stuff and work on them, obviously securing the upper and lower halves permanently is not exactly something you want to do. While on that note, here we have the lower pan here of the turret, and this brings us to the rear ventilator. The rear ventilator that's molded in is a pretty decent piece. The travel lock that's supplied with it, it's okay. I am going to be replacing it with one of my cast resin ones, so this is not going to stay. But probably one of the biggest things that can be revised is with the bottom portion here. You can see that the bottom portion is completely sealed off. However, on the real vehicle, the whole point of this blister here is to be a blower, and it's to pump fresh air into the vehicle. And so this is obviously done by the bottom section here being completely open. So in order to improve the accuracy, this is going to be addressed. The piece, fortunately, is just glued on with just a few drops of glue, if that, and so it just pops directly off on this one example. You want to be careful, as you don't want to yank and break the piece off completely. So now that the blower is removed, the only thing I need to do is just delete this little tang that we have right here emerging from the turret casting. I don't need to go inside and remove all of it, just the area that's exposed. The portion on the inside is still going to be necessary because this is where this piece is going to index on and be glued to prior to the piece being remounted, sealing everything up together. So the blower just slides directly onto the upper, as you can see there. And on the lower, you can see what it looks like with that little tang now removed. Also, in case someone's wondering, why do I have little bits of masking tape found on the bottom portion of the turret? Well, it's quite simple. You see, the fasteners are still in their locations. Basically, when I was taking the model apart, I just undone all the fasteners, and then while leaving them carefully in their little wells, I just put the tape over. This is done just to prevent any sort of fasteners from getting lost. And if you are as fastener loss prone as I am, this is a sure way to prevent that from happening. So, with the blister now mounted back onto the turret, just before I seal this baby off, I am going to go ahead, patch in all the electronics to make sure everything works appropriately. Well, after the turret was thoroughly tested, which, by the way, passed with flying colors, the upper and lower sections were permanently secured together with glues, as well as the fasteners. The fasteners, of course, have also been Loctited in place. From this point on, I can continue with the remainder of the exterior details on the turret, which would first include taking care of this fastener location hole over here, as well as also possibly adding a little bit more cast texturing on the turret on a few certain locations. But we'll touch upon that towards the end of the video. After the turret was done, I also went ahead and did a little bit more work on the upper hull. You'll notice that the turret location has been masked, and the entire upper has been primed with flat black, and I also went ahead and added some of the base coat to the inner turret wall areas of the model. This was done because when the turret gets secured in place, you're not going to be able to get access to these areas over here, and with the way these Taigen and Henlong tanks are designed, everything is fastened in place with bolts, and you're not going to be able to just simply pop the turret off as you can on something like a 135. So before the turret gets affixed to the hull, I generally take care of this over here because you have ample amount of access to get the paint into their appropriate locations, which will prevent any sort of, well, missed spots after everything is fully assembled. With the mask removed, you can see that the bare plastic is now fully exposed. Keep in mind, the reason why you don't want to get paint on here in any way, shape, or form is because you need this bearing surface here as smooth as possible in order for the turret to freely rotate. If there's paint on here, it's going to add extra unneeded friction, which is just going to add strain to the turret rotation motor. By having it on bare plastic, this is a much more slippery type surface compared to the same surface with the layers of paint applied. And I'm pretty sure someone out there is going to say, well, John, just, lubricate this and you'll be fine. Well, if you do that, now you're going to have the runoff of oil, grease, or even graphite onto this location where it's just going to bleed out and really just hurt the look of the model. By just going with this simple approach, you don't have to worry about any sort of damage whatsoever, and the turret can literally just freely rotate, as you see right now. Also, once the turret is mounted onto the hull, you're not exactly going to see that bare plastic because it's fully encapsulated by the turret itself. And here's the turret now remounted to the body. The turret itself is secured to the body via those two fasteners on that geared tooth ring that I showed earlier on in the unboxing portion of the video. Before I went ahead and did that, though, you can see that I went ahead and first completed the bodywork that I touched upon before. That fastener location that was back here is completely removed, and the seam that separated the two sections, it has also been blended in. The bodywork also includes the cast texturing, which can be found on all of the surfaces found on the T23 turret. Lastly, and probably what's most obvious at this point here, prior to the turret being secured to the body, I also went ahead and painted the lower extremities of the turret as well as the intersections here of the mantlet. This is for the same reasons that I already touched upon before for the upper hull. While working on the turret, the last new component that I designed consists of this runner that we have right here. This runner consists of the 50 caliber storage equipment, which is found iconically on the rear portion of not just the Sherman bustles, but specifically with this set, the 76mm T23 turret. The Taigen kit does supply you with these components over here. However, just like with the other kit supply parts found on these Taigen and basically most of the RTR models out there, they are rather simplistic in their overall size and shape. To Taigen's credit, their parts are very robust, and because of that, if you're the type of person that likes to put excessive wear on your models, or if you drive them around a lot, the Taigen pieces might be a better fit for you. But if you're looking to enhance your model and take it up to the next detail level, the Taigen ones do fall short. And that brings us to the components that we have right here. This set here is all made from HD 3D printings, and the set is literally my 1/6 scale counterpart, but scaled down and optimized for 1/16. One difference between this and the 1/6 scale variant is that on the 1/6 scale one, the rails, the barrel clips, and the receiver clamp here are actually separate components that get assembled in sub-assemblies, and then you would install it to the vehicle. While on the 1/16 counterpart here, they are all one integral printing, and from here they just get mounted directly to the rear portion of the turret. Outside of those other details that I touched upon before, the set also includes the clamp as well as the clamp hinge. And you will notice that there are two found on this set here. That's just in case there's a mishap and you accidentally break one of the pieces during either deburring, assembly, or possibly during display, and you have a spare one ready to go in case such a mishap were to happen. The piece is designed to be hinged where the part is fully functional, and I believe I touched upon a similar feature on my 75mm 50 caliber storage equipment set that's also listed on the ECA product line. That set too is a 3D printed or a HD 3D printed component. Just like with that set, this set also comes with the vane sight, and the vane sight that's supplied with this set is specifically the one that does not have the elevating riser on it, as that piece would not be present on the T23. One bit of detailing that does make this better compared to the stock Taigen one is the geometry here of the barrel clamp system. The Taigen one, they took a shortcut and they basically grafted the 75mm version on the angled rail over here, which, although again it suits their purpose just fine, on the real version the geometry was very different, resembling more of the piece that we have right here. Also, with the way the barrel clamps are rendered, you will see that they are free from the side portion of the wall, and if you look at the stock kit ones, it's just one amorphous blob that's basically all integrally molded into one another. The only thing that is absent on this set here are the well beads that still need to be sculpted by the builder once they mount these sections to the stock Taigen model. Well, that was a bit in-depth and ran a little bit longer than I anticipated, but with that, that wraps up part 2 of this 4-part video series on the 1/16 scale radio-controlled M4A3 76 Sherman tank. If you like this video, please subscribe to this channel, where it's a good way to keep updated on new posted content, being part 3 and 4 of this video set, as well as the other smaller and larger scale build videos that are showcased on this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular model, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been posted on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to check out eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/16 and 1/6 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on part 3. Take care.